Chapter 1. A Stitch in Time, from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marleycombite was a Thursday afternoon in late March, and the village of Marleycombe was stirring from winter's grip. Though the wind still carried a faint bite, the hedgerows bloomed with timid primroses, and sunlight streamed in golden slants through the tall windows of the village hall. Inside, a dozen women sat in a loose horseshoe around a folding table, draped in chintz. Teacups rattled, scissors snipped, and needles glinted. The sewing circle, as it had come to be called in both the local paper and whispered judgment, was a blend of necessity and entertainment. Ostensibly, they gathered to repair altar cloths or hem costumes for the spring fete, but in truth, most came for the gossip. Miss Marple, seated near the window, moved her needle with steady precision. She was darning a small child's sock, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it gave her hands something to do while her mind listened. She was not a regular member of the circle, but she had been asked to come this week by Mrs. Judith Morley, the vicar's wife, who had said quite earnestly, "Jane, I do believe your calm presence helps to dilute things." Dilution was perhaps necessary. Ever since Fiona Ross had joined 3 months ago, tensions had begun to simmer. Fiona, beautiful in a brash sort of way, red lipstick, too many bracelets, had moved to Marleycombe with her husband Clive, who had something to do with imports. They'd taken the big house on Ivy Lane, which had stood empty since Major Hackett's death. It was all too sudden, too modern. "I can't abide the color," murmured Mrs. Temple from across the table, nodding toward the bright green yarn in Fiona's lap. "Lime, is it? Looks like something a parakeet would wear." "Fashionable in London," Fiona said smoothly, without looking up. "You wouldn't understand." The silence that followed was brittle. Miss Marple glanced up from her stitching, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. She noted the sharp twitch in Mrs. Temple's mouth, the flush in young Emily Drew's cheeks. Several pairs of eyes darted toward Fiona, but it was not all disdain. There was something else: curiosity, envy, resentment. Yes, there were many. Little undercurrents here. The meeting went on. 2 more rounds of tea were poured. A cake was sliced, carrot, slightly dry, and the women began to pack up their threads and embroidery hoops. Conversation shifted from Fiona's fashion sense to the upcoming flower show. Then, quite suddenly, the door of the village hall burst open. It was Geraldine Latchmore, Marleycombe's postmistress, and a woman who had never once entered the sewing circle, standing in the doorway, her eyes wild, her breath caught in her throat. "Come quickly," she gasped. "It's Fiona. I think she's dead." The world paused. Miss Marple's needle froze midair. A teacup slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the tile. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Mrs. Temple clutched her chest. Emily Drew screamed. Someone knocked over the sugar bowl. Miss Marple stood quietly and placed her mending on the chair. "Where?" she asked, her voice calm as falling snow. "The garden," Geraldine said, eyes wide. "Behind the hall, by the rose beds." Miss Marple moved swiftly through the side door. The early sun now felt cold against her skin. There, crumpled, among the first buds of climbing roses, lay Fiona Ross. Her green yarn had unspooled like a trail behind her, and her eyes, once glittering and full of hidden jabs, stared glassily at the sky. Miss Marple took a slow breath and glanced at the scattered spool, the gardening gloves half covered in dirt nearby, the smear of lipstick on the collar of Fiona's coat. She said nothing, but her mind had already begun to stitch the pattern. Chapter 2. The Tangled Threads from Miss Marple. And the murder in the sewing circle. Village Marleycombe. The time Constable Elgin arrived, red-faced, out of breath, and clearly just roused from a nap. The sewing circle had spilled out into the garden in scattered clumps. Murmuring in half-hushed tones, I was just saying to her not 10 minutes before, whispered Mrs. Dunsley, shaking her head vigorously, that she should stop pulling so hard on that blasted wool, or she'd tear something. I didn't mean well, not that. Constable Elgin cleared his throat. Ladies, please, step back. Nobody touch anything. I'll need to fetch Inspector Cray at once. Miss Marple, who had quietly observed the scene while standing near the edge of the rose-bed, turned to him gently. I shouldn't move the body just yet, Mr. Elgin. You see, Fiona hasn't been dead long. A matter of minutes, I would think. Elgin blinked. You reckon so, Miss Marple? I don't reckon anything, she replied with a faint smile. But her hands are still warm, and the stiffness hasn't quite set in. Besides, her tea was still steaming when I walked out. A hush followed her words. Even those who disapproved of Miss Marple's frequent observations of death had to admit the woman noticed things. What did she die of, though? Asked young Emily Drew, eyes wide. There's no blood. There's more than one way to kill, Miss Marple murmured. She was looking not at the body now, but at the scatter of details around it, the broken heel of Fiona's left shoe, the odd glint of something metallic just beneath the rose bush, the faint scent in the eye. Air, like almonds, perhaps. Mrs. Temple, who had been the first to express distaste for Fiona's choice of yarn, had gone very quiet. A few minutes later, Inspector Cray arrived, a man of decent sense, short temper, and the permanent expression of one resigned to dealing with people stupider than he was. He had learned, reluctantly, that Miss Marple's interference often resulted in solved cases. Miss Marple, he said, touching his hat, I might have known. I was only here for the sewing, she said mildly. Not the dying. Cray crouched near the body, peering over his glasses. No wound, no trauma, no visible signs of a struggle. Someone fetch the village doctor. I'll want a post-mortem. I believe Dr. Cornfield is away in Bath for his niece's wedding, said Judith Morley, wringing her hands. Blast! Then I'll call over to Dr. Cattermole from Windermere. He stood, brushing off his knees. Nobody leaves the village, not until we've had statements. The villagers began to disperse slowly, some still clutching their half-finished embroidery like shields. Murmurs swirled in the air like midges. Ross, alive and sneering moments ago, was now dead beneath the roses. But why? Later that evening, the sitting room of the vicarage was unusually quiet. Miss Marple sat with a cup of lukewarm tea in her lap, not drinking, just thinking. Judith Morley paced near the fireplace. I know Fiona was difficult, Judith said, but who would actually kill her? Many people are difficult, Miss Marple replied softly, but Fiona had a particular gift for rubbing salt into old wounds. The kind of wounds villages pretend don't exist. Judith stopped pacing. You think it was someone from the sewing circle? I think, said Miss Marple, that it was someone who knew her well enough to despise her, and someone close. Enough to get her alone behind the hall in broad daylight. A knock came at the door. It was Geraldine, the postmistress. Her hair was still wild from the afternoon's events. I thought I should bring this, she said breathlessly, holding out a small envelope. It was addressed to Fiona, but she never collected it. Came in with the post this morning. Miss. Marple took the envelope delicately. No return address. But inside, a single slip of paper, typed. It read, I haven't forgotten what you did. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Chapter 3. Patterns Beneath the Surface, from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marley Combe pattered softly against the window panes of the vicarage the following morning. The world outside was gray, slick, and subdued, as though the village itself mourned the sudden death of Fiona Ross, though in truth, Marley Combe was not a place given to mourning so much as speculation. In the tea-room near the church green, 2 women whispered behind teacups. "Poison, I heard," said Mrs. Tilling, whose son worked at the chemist's. "Naturally," said her companion, Mrs. Headley. "To meet a death for anything else. And in broad daylight. In the garden behind the hall, no less. Shameless. I suppose someone could have slipped something into her tea," Mrs. Tilling mused. "They say almonds. You smell almonds when it's cyanide, don't you?" Mrs. Headley looked sharply over her rim. "So you've heard that, too." From the table behind them, a man in a flat cap leaned in and murmured, "Bet it was the husband. Always is. Quiet type, those are the worst." And so it went, Marley Comb's favorite pastime. But at Danby House, the grand, ivy-choked manor. At the edge of Ivy Lane, the late Fiona Ross's husband, Clive, sat alone in the drawing-room with Inspector Cray. The curtains were half drawn. A whiskey sat untouched on the table, and Clive Ross, ruddy-faced and soft-spoken, looked more tired than grief-stricken. I knew Fiona could be. "Trying," he admitted, voice low. "But murder? In Marleycombe? This isn't the world we came to escape." Cray made a note in his book. "When did you last see your wife?" "This morning." "She left for the sewing circle at about 1:30. I was in the study, doing accounts. She was well. She was in good spirits. Any idea who might have sent her this?" Cray held up the note Miss Marple had turned over. "I haven't forgotten what you did." Clive stared at this paper, expression unreadable. "No," he said finally. "But I'm not surprised. Fiona wasn't popular. She could be cruel, Inspector. Charming, yes, but underneath. She had a way of finding old scars and picking at them." Cray regarded him carefully. "Did she have enemies?" "Everyone has enemies," Clive said with a sad little shrug. "But Fiona made hers feel small." "That's worse." Meanwhile, in her neat cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat with her cat, Napoleon, on her lap, a faint frown on her brow dot. She was not a woman given to wild guesses. She believed in patterns, in the way people behaved, how they lied, how they revealed truth in the smallest gestures. She had seen similar cases before, though never in precisely the same way. There was, she thought, something almost performative about the murder, done during a community meeting, near people, in public, but just hidden enough. Someone wanted Fiona silenced, yes, but also seen. She recalled the green yarn scattered like a trail, as if she'd been pulled backward, or dragged, and the metallic glint beneath the rosebush. Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to a narrow cabinet. From its shelf, she retrieved a worn notebook labeled simply Garden Club. She flipped through pages of names and events. From the past 5 years, Fiona Ross had joined the gardening committee briefly last autumn. Only 3 meetings. She'd abruptly stopped attending after a quarrel with... "Ah, yes, Mrs. Lavinia Temple." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She'd seen the tightness in Mrs. Temple's mouth yesterday. And something else? Guilt, perhaps? She closed the notebook. The killer had either slipped poison into the tea or somehow administered it outside, in the garden. The latter seemed risky, but poison in a drink? Quite possible, especially if one brought their own flask. As Fiona sometimes did. Miss Marple turned her attention to her knitting, not because she wished to finish the scarf she'd been working on, but because, like so many things in life, the answer often came when one was thinking of something else entirely. And then she remembered a small moment, something Judith Morley had said in passing last week. Honestly, Fiona's lucky we even let her join the circle. If people knew what she did in Dorset. Miss Marple's hands paused mid-stitch. What had Fiona done in Dorset? Chapter 4. Whispered pasts from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing circle. Village. Marleycombe rain cleared by mid-morning, leaving the village cloaked in that peculiar washed stillness that follows a storm, where even the birds seem to tread softly. But the calm in Marleycombe was only on the surface. Underneath, the village buzzed with speculation. At the high street grocer's, customers lingered far longer than usual. At the hairdresser's, appointments became excuses for information gathering. And in the vicarage, Miss Marple sat beside Judith Morley in the small book-lined parlor, her tea untouched. "I was hoping," Miss Marple said gently, "you might tell me what you meant when you said Fiona was lucky to be let into the sewing circle because of what she did in Dorset." Judith flushed. "Oh, Jane, I shouldn't have said that." "Then it's best to say it properly now." There was a long pause. Outside, a thrush sang once, then fell silent. "Well," Judith said, voice low, "it wasn't something people talked about, not in newspapers or anything like that. But Lavinia Temple's sister lives in Dorchester. Word got around. Fiona's name had been linked to a situation." "What kind of situation?" Miss Marple asked, though she already had her suspicions. "She was a nanny," Judith said, "before she married Clive. Took care of a little girl, a wealthy family. Something happened. A child nearly drowned in the garden pond. Fiona insisted it was an accident, but there were rumors that she'd left the girl alone, or worse, pushed her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet she wasn't arrested?" "No proof. The family hushed it up. But she left the village the next week, quietly, discreetly. Clive married her the year after. Nobody ever brought it up here, of course. But some knew." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And some never forgot." At that same moment, Inspector Cray stood outside the door of Ivy Cottage, a modest home on the outskirts of Marleycombe, frowning down at the autopsy report in his hands. Cause of death: hydrogen cyanide ingestion, likely administered via beverage. Time of death estimated at 2:37 p.m. He knocked. Lavinia Temple answered. Still dressed in her neat housecoat, she looked startled, though not altogether surprised. "I was expecting you, Inspector," she said simply. "Please come in." Her living room was spotless. A tea tray sat untouched on the sideboard. Embroidery framed the walls. Her manner, as always, was precise and slightly cold, like someone who preferred order to people. "I imagine this is about Fiona," she said, sitting primly. "You didn't like her," Cray said without preamble. Lavinia gave a thin smile. "No, I didn't. Why?" She was unkind. "That's enough in a place like this, isn't it? But if you're asking whether I poisoned her," she looked him straight in the eye, "then no. I didn't. Tempting, but no." Cray leaned forward. "You knew what happened in Dorset. So did half the village. I made no secret of it. Enough to want her gone?" "She was already gone," Lavinia said coolly. Fiona was all surface, silk scarves and scandal. But something underneath had rotted. People like that destroy themselves eventually. I didn't need to lift a finger. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked slowly through the churchyard, where crocuses were blooming in shy clusters. She paused beneath the yew tree, where little benches curved around the base, and sat, hands folded neatly in her lap. Someone approached. It was Emily Drew. Quiet, gentle Emily, with a letter in her hand and worry in her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said, almost in a whisper. "Can I speak with you?" "Of course, dear. Sit with me." Emily sat, hands trembling slightly. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble," she said quickly. "But I think someone from the circle was hiding something." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Go on." "I was helping clear up after the meeting yesterday. I saw Mrs. Dunsley pouring out the rest of the tea Fiona didn't drink before the police came. She seemed nervous. And when I asked her about it later, she pretended she hadn't." Miss Marple's fingers curled gently around her walking stick. "Thank you, Emily," she said, with quiet gravity. "You've done a very brave thing." Because now the pattern had begun to emerge, faint but visible. A secret in Fiona's past. A teacup tampered with. A cover-up by someone who feared what that cup might reveal. Someone who had always smiled sweetly and sewed the neatest hems in the circle. Chapter 5. Poison in the Pot, from Miss Marple, and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village Marleycombeth. Next morning dawned clear, with a cold brightness that made the hedges sparkle with dew. Marleycombe appeared serene again, but the illusion didn't fool Miss Marple. She had learned, over many years, that human evil rarely arrives with thunder and lightning. It comes in sunshine, with smiles and neatly buttoned cardigans. She stood outside the church hall, peering at the side path where Fiona Ross had been found. Her body collapsed among the early roses, that garish green yarn trailing like a signature. Miss Marple looked not at the flowers now, but at the hall's side door, the gravel beneath, and the war wooden bench near the back corner. The murderer had not counted on Emily Drew's memory, nor had they expected someone to notice a very specific detail, that the tea Fiona had been drinking was poured out and rinsed before police arrived. The tea might have been the method. The person pouring it, or removing it, might be the key. Miss Marple walked slowly to the back garden and knelt down, inspecting the gravel near the rose bushes. She picked up a small, curved object, a silver teaspoon, with a faint trace of lipstick near the bowl. Not Fiona's shade, though. Too pale. A strange place for a spoon to be, she thought. Meanwhile, at Ivy Cottage, Lavinia Temple stared into her cold porridge. Across the table, her maid, Maudie, watched nervously. "Ma'am," Maudie ventured, "are you going to the circle meeting on Saturday? I heard they might cancel it, but Mrs. Dunsley said—" "Mrs. Dunsley says a great many things," Lavinia replied curtly. There was an edge to her voice this morning, more than usual. She had not slept well. The inspector's visit the day before had stirred up old fears. She had disliked Fiona Ross, had hated her, if she was honest. Fiona's presence in the village had felt like a wound reopened. But she hadn't killed her. Of that she was certain, and yet someone had. Inspector Cray was beginning to feel the pressure. No arrests. A village teetering into hysteria. An official cause of death, cyanide, but no clear path to its delivery. He had spoken to everyone at the sewing circle. They were all, as he put it, village respectable. But respectable people lied too. He knew that. The key, he suspected, was the tea. That afternoon, he returned to the hall to examine the kitchen area. He found it mostly untouched, save for the telltale signs of a quick cleanup. Towels hung out to dry. A bin freshly emptied. Inside the rubbish bin, he found a broken thermos flask. The glass inside had shattered, likely from heat. But there was a sharp, sweet smell lingering in the lining. Not tea. Something sharper. He had it bagged and sent off for testing. If it came back positive for cyanide residue, then the case was narrowing. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was walking briskly toward Mrs. Dunsley's home, a tidy red brick house on the corner of Mill Lane. She was not surprised to find the curtains closed. Though it was just past noon. Mrs. Dunsley opened the door after 2 knocks, wearing her apron and a pinched smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. You'll have to excuse the mess." The room was spotless. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said kindly. "I've only a little question about Tuesday's tea. You see, I was wondering, do you happen to remember who made the pot Fiona drank from?" Mrs. Dunsley hesitated, just a flicker, but long enough. "Oh, I believe it was Lavinia," she said quickly. "She always insists on using her own blend, something herbal." "That's strange," Miss Marple replied, head tilting slightly. "Because I found this in the roses." She held up the pale lipstick-marked spoon. "Not Fiona's color, I think. But I remember you had a rather similar shade at the last fete. You wore it with that pink tweed jacket." Mrs. Dunsley's eyes widened, just for a moment. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "It's difficult, of course. Perhaps you didn't mean to hurt her. Perhaps you only meant to frighten her." Mrs. Dunsley sat down heavily. "It wasn't like that." Miss Marple waited. "She was going to tell Clive something," the woman said at last, her voice tight. "About me. About my brother. Something from years ago that no one else knew. And she enjoyed it, threatening people, smiling when she saw you squirm. So you thought you'd teach her a lesson?" "She was cruel," Mrs. Dunsley whispered. "But I only meant to put a little in her own flask, the one she always brought. Just a taste. Just to scare her. I didn't know how much to use." Miss Marple closed her eyes. It was, sadly, not the first time she had heard such a confession from someone who underestimated poison and overestimated control dot by the time Inspector Cray arrived to take Mrs. Dunsley in for questioning. The village had already begun. To hear the news dot, Miss Marple stood by her garden gate, watching the clouds drift above Marleycombe, her knitting in a basket at her side. Fiona Ross had stirred too many secrets. But in the end, it had not been hate that killed her, only fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was far more dangerous than most would believe. Chapter 6. Old threads unravel from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing circle. Village, Marleycombers. Dunsley's arrest swept through Marleycombe faster than a brush fire on the moor. By that afternoon, the post office queue buzzed with speculation, and Mrs. Tilling had told no fewer than 6 people that she always suspected there was something peculiar about her Victoria sponge. Far too perfect, you know. The WI canceled their bunting meeting out of respect and caution, and Judith Morley received 3 phone calls in an hour from residents worried the vicar's wife might be next. At the heart of it all, Miss Marple sat in her garden with a pair of shears in one hand and her copy of the Times folded in her lap. Napoleon, her gray cat, sprawled luxuriously on the stone bench beside her. The roses were coming in late this year, but that didn't concern her. What did concern her was a lingering doubt, a thread that didn't quite fit the pattern. Because while Mrs. Dunsley had confessed to tampering with Fiona's tea, the details, a crushed thermos, the broken spoon, the position of the body, suggested something more deliberate, more finished. And if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned from a lifetime of observation, it was this: poisoners who act out of fear usually make mistakes. But this murder had been executed with too much control. And Mrs. Dunsley? She was anxious, high-strung, but not methodical. Miss Marple's frown deepened. She needed to speak to someone who knew Fiona better than the sewing circle ever had. Clive Ross had not left Danby House in 2 days. Inspector Cray had questioned him twice, both times to no avail. Clive was grieving, or so he claimed, and while no tears had been shed, his sorrow had a dull, convincing weight to it. But Miss Marple knew that grief wore many disguises, and guilt could often pass for mourning. She arrived just after 4 o'clock, escorted to the sitting room by the housekeeper, a woman with anxious hands and a tight bun. Clive stood by the fireplace, a brandy in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, weary but polite, "I didn't expect you." "No one ever does," she replied, setting her handbag down delicately. "You loved your wife, Mr. Ross." He gave a hollow laugh. "She was difficult. That's not a secret. But yes, I loved her in my way." "She had a past," Miss Marple said calmly, "and enemies. Many of them, perhaps. But she also had secrets you didn't share with the police." Clive looked sharply at her. "I told them everything." "No," she said gently. You told them what made you look sad, not what made you angry. He was silent. Then, she was blackmailing me. Miss Marple blinked slowly. She found out, Clive went on, voice low, about a business in London. A client of mine, illegal trade, import licenses. Something I'd buried long ago. She found the papers while looking for one of her scarves. And she used them against you? He nodded. Said she'd hand them to the board if I ever left her. That's why I stayed. I hated her, Miss Marple. I truly did. But I didn't kill her. Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment, then said, But you didn't drink the tea either. He looked startled. What? At the sewing circle. You often visited, didn't you? Stopped by to bring Fiona her umbrella or to fetch her early. I might have. But on Tuesday, you didn't. Nor did you drink any tea, though. Fiona always brought extra. His face paled. Miss Marple nodded. I think you knew something was going to happen. You just didn't want to stop it. That evening, Inspector Cray returned to Miss Marple's cottage. Mrs. Dunsley's story doesn't match the evidence, he said, rubbing his forehead. She confessed to poisoning Fiona's flask. But it wasn't in her flask. It was in the second cup. The one poured from the communal pot. Forensics just confirmed it. Then someone else finished what she started, Miss Marple said softly. Someone who knew her intentions. Perhaps even encouraged them. You think Clive Ross? No, she said, standing and moving to the window. I think someone more subtle. Someone who always listened. Always noticed. Someone who saw Fiona for what she was, and feared what might come next. She turned, her eyes sharp. I think Emily Drew knows more than she's told. Chapter 7. Quiet as a Mouse, from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marley Combe Drew had always been described with words like sweet, harmless, and meek. At 28, she still lived with her ailing mother in a stone cottage just past the village bakery, walked to the church in sensible shoes, and volunteered dutifully for flower arrangements and fate ribbons. But Miss Marple had long understood. At the meekest girls often held the strongest silences. And when Miss Marple knocked gently at Emily's door just past tea time, she had a quiet certainty. She wasn't coming for gossip. She was coming for truth. Emily opened the door with her usual polite smile. Miss Marple, how kind. I was hoping for a word, Miss Marple said, if you're not too busy. Emily hesitated for half a second before stepping back. Of course, Mother's resting. The sitting room smelled faintly of camphor and lavender polish. A teacup sat half-finished on the side table. Knitting lay folded in a neat wicker basket, lilac wool, small stitches, very tight. Miss Marple took the chair near the fire. I've been thinking, she said gently, about your kindness in coming to me after Fiona's death, about the tea being poured away. Emily nodded quickly. I only wanted to help. Yes, but you didn't tell the police. I didn't want to cause trouble for Mrs. Dunsley. She always brings the biscuits. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Dear Emily, that's not why, though, is it? There was a long pause. The only sound was the slow ticking of a wooden mantel clock. Emily lowered her eyes. She was cruel, she whispered. Fiona, I know everyone says it, but she really was. What did she do to you? Emily's lips trembled. She said, things about Mother, about how she'd seen people like her put away. And she laughed. She said she'd visit once it happened. And what did you do, dear? I wrote the note, Emily said quietly. The one that said, I haven't forgotten what you did. I didn't mean anything by it. I just wanted her to feel afraid, the way I felt every time she looked at me. Miss Marple leaned back, nodding slowly. You weren't the only one who feared her, but you were the only one who watched her so closely. Emily looked up. I believe, said Miss Marple. "You saw what Mrs. Dunsley did. You knew she'd tampered with the tea, and you let her believe she'd done the killing." Emily was silent for a long time. Then she said very softly, "She only put a tiny amount, barely anything. Fiona drank it and laughed, said it tasted unusual. That's when I knew she'd survive." "So you made sure she didn't?" Emily's fingers twisted together in her lap. "I waited. I'd taken a bottle of garden pesticide the week before. I knew it had cyanide, the real kind, not the old wives' tale kind. When Fiona went out into the garden, I followed with the second cup. I told her I'd made her a fresh one. She liked me. She trusted me." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And that's why she drank it." "I didn't mean to kill her," Emily said, tears in her eyes now. "I only wanted her to stop. Just stop." Miss Marple reached over and gently took her hand. "I believe you." "But I did it," Emily whispered. "And now someone else is in a cell because of me." That evening, Inspector Cray stared at Miss Marple, stunned. "You're telling me Mrs. Dunsley thought she killed Fiona, but it was Emily Drew who gave her the fatal dose?" Miss Marple nodded. "They both played a part," she said. "One through fear, the other through pain. And Fiona Ross? She sewed every inch of it herself." Cray ran a hand through his hair. "I'll have to bring Emily in. Are you sure she'll confess?" "She already has," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not to you, but to someone she trusted." She looked out into the village night, where the windows of Marleycombe glowed warm and calm once again. "But remember, Inspector, not all murderers are monsters. Some are simply cornered mice, and even the quietest mouse can bite." Chapter 8. A village divided from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing circle. Village, Marleycombe. Sunrise, the whole of Marleycombe had heard. Emily Drew. Gentle Emily with the soft smile and flower print dresses had been taken in for questioning. Mrs. Dunsley, once thought to be the killer, had been released and was now too unwell for visitors. According to her neighbor, who had peeked through the hedge and seen her pacing in a dressing gown, muttering to herself, the village was no longer just shocked. It was divided. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Headley sniffed and said, "I always knew there was something not quite right about her." That mousy voice, very suspicious. But at the church, Judith Morley clutched her hymnal with trembling hands and told the vicar she cared for her mother so sweetly. "I don't believe it. Not really." At the heart of it all stood Miss Marple, who had neither condemned nor defended Emily, but simply sat with the truth, as she always did, calmly and without drama. It was not her job to judge. That belonged to others. And yet it weighed on her all the same. Inspector Cray sat in his office at the police station, staring across the desk at Emily Drew. She looked pale but composed. No tears now. Just a worn stillness, like paper that had been folded too many times. "I don't think you're evil, Miss Drew," Cray said finally. "But you committed a very real crime." Emily nodded once. "I know. You tampered with the tea. You deliberately gave Fiona a fatal dose, even if the idea came after Mrs. Dunsley's attempt failed." "I did." "Why not go to the police?" Cray asked. "Why not report what Fiona had done? Her threats? Her cruelty?" Emily looked down. "Because no one would believe me. Not over her. Fiona could make people feel small, but in public she was dazzling. People didn't see the corners." Cray leaned back in his chair. "The courts will decide what to do with you. But I'll make sure they know everything, including the truth about Fiona." Emily nodded again, but her voice was very quiet. "I think that's all I wanted." That evening, Miss Marple walked the long way home, passing by the village hall, where the roses now stood slightly taller, as if relieved of a burden. There was no plaque, no marker. But for those who had been there, the place would never be quite the same. As she turned the corner toward Church Lane, she saw Mrs. Dunsley sitting alone on her front step. "Jane," the older woman called, her voice thin. May I speak with you?" Miss Marple paused, then walked over and sat beside her. "I was ready to carry it," Mrs. Dunsley said, eyes hollow. "The guilt, the shame, it was almost a relief, you know. To be caught, to be punished." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Because you believed you'd failed to stop her." "I believed I'd done it, and even when I found out I hadn't, I still felt responsible." "You weren't the poison," Miss Marple said gently. "You were only the match." Mrs. Dunsley gave a bitter smile. "Matches still burn." That night, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Napoleon curled at her feet. In her lap was a notebook, plain brown cover, the kind she reserved for private records. She wrote, "Case of Fiona Ross resolved. Primary act of murder by Emily Drew, under emotional duress and prolonged psychological torment. Initial tampering by Mrs. Dunsley, contributing factor only. Victim had established pattern of emotional manipulation, blackmail, and cruelty." Paused, then added, "Motives layered, blame shared, pain deep-rooted, justice uncertain." She closed the book. Outside, Marley Combe exhaled, but Miss Marple knew the village would never forget what bloomed in the sewing circle that spring. A pattern stitched with secrets, and a final knot tied with silence. Chapter 9. Needles and Nerves. From Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village, Marley Combe. Days after Emily Drew's arrest, the sewing circle met again, out of habit more than desire. The gathering had shrunk by nearly half. The usual laughter had thinned to awkward murmurs. The tea, once poured with warm familiarity, now passed from hand to hand like a loaded pistol. Mrs. Temple arrived 5 minutes late and avoided eye contact with everyone. She took a seat by the window and began stitching furiously, her needle punching through fabric like a warning. Judith Morley tried to keep the conversation afloat. "Shall we finish the church banners before Easter?" she offered, though her voice trembled. Emily had started that purple edging. "It would be a shame not to finish it." No one responded. Miss Marple, seated as always with her quiet knitting, watched. Not the banners or the stitches, but the people. The way Mrs. Dunsley's hands shook slightly as she reached for a biscuit. The way Mrs. Tilling kept glancing at the door, as though half expecting Fiona to appear in a silk scarf, smirking. Fiona Ross had been the loudest voice in the room. But even in death, her silence was louder still. "Do you believe she meant it?" Mrs. Temple finally asked. "Emily, I mean. Or was it just a mistake?" There was a pause. "She meant it," Miss Marple said gently, "but not in the way." "You mean?" The others looked at her. "She meant to make Fiona stop," Miss Marple continued. "Not to kill, but to protect. People like Fiona know exactly which wounds to press. And sometimes people don't scream. They simply break." Mrs. Temple swallowed. "And what about Mrs. Dunsley?" "She made her own mistake, thinking fear could be measured in teaspoons." A long silence followed. Then, surprisingly, it was Mrs. Dunsley who spoke. "We all knew what Fiona was," she said. "We just never thought it would cost anyone anything." "She was wicked," muttered Mrs. Tilling, "but she didn't deserve to die." "No," said Miss Marple, eyes on her yarn, "but she didn't deserve silence either." That evening, a new rumor began to flicker through Marleycombe, like the first tremor before a storm. It began with young Robert Tilling, who worked weekends at the post office. He had overheard his uncle, the retired solicitor from Windermere, mention Fiona Ross's name in a conversation about a sealed letter and a missing beneficiary. Something about a trust fund. Something about fraud. Miss Marple, when she heard, It simply nodded. Of course, Fiona hadn't come to Marleycombe to settle down. She had come to vanish, not from the world, but from the consequences she'd left behind. And now those consequences were beginning to drift to the surface. Inspector Cray, for his part, had closed the case officially. Emily Drew would be charged, but recommendations for leniency were being prepared. Letters from villagers, statements of character, even from Mrs. Dunsley. It was, as Cray admitted to Miss Marple over a modest supper at the vicarage, the most sympathetic homicide I've ever seen. Sympathy, Miss Marple replied, is not the same as innocence, but it's what makes justice bearable. Cray nodded. You think there'll be more to come? Miss Marple smiled faintly. There always is with people like Fiona. When they unravel, it's never from a single stitch. That night, Miss Marple sat once more at her desk, turning her thoughts over like the pages of a well-worn book. A thought had been pressing at her for days, not about Emily, or Fiona, or even the tea, but about the envelope, the typed note Fiona had received. I haven't forgotten what you did. Typed, anonymous. And, most importantly, not written by Emily Drew, who had confessed only to slipping the tea, not sending the letter. Miss Marple tapped her pen against her notebook, a soft frown forming. Someone else had warned Fiona, and that someone, she feared, might still be watching, waiting, stitching their own revenge in the quiet corners of Marleycombe. ChatGPT said, Chapter 10, the second needle from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village, Marleycombe. Next morning, the village awoke to a second ripple, not as large as a murder, but unsettling nonetheless. Mrs. Headley, who rarely ventured out before 9, had gone to collect her post early and returned white-faced, muttering to herself. She claimed to have seen someone standing by Fiona Ross's grave in the churchyard. A woman, dressed in navy. Not from the village. She wasn't crying, Mrs. Headley insisted later. Just standing, as if waiting. Miss Marple, seated at her window with a fresh cup of tea, heard the news before noon. She already had her coat on by the time Judith Morley came calling, breathless and pink-faced. Jane, have you heard? I have, Miss Marple said softly, slipping on her gloves. And I believe it's time we asked the late Mrs. Ross a few more questions. Fiona's grave was modest. No headstone yet, just a mound of dark earth with a simple wooden cross, bearing her name. But someone had laid fresh lily on it. White lily. Miss Marple stood before them, hands folded around the handle of her walking stick. She noted the faint indentations in the mud, narrow heels, perhaps size 5, a careful walker. Not village shoes. Behind her, footsteps crunched on gravel. It was Inspector Cray. She left before anyone could speak to her, he said, coming. To stand beside her. Didn't leave a name. Just asked the vicar if she could visit the grave. She didn't want to be seen, Miss Marple murmured, but not for grief, for guilt. Cray looked at her sharply. You think she's connected to Fiona? I think Fiona was running from something. That note? I haven't forgotten what you did. Emily didn't write it. She never learned to type, you'll recall. She handwrote everything. So who did? That, Miss Marple said, is the final thread I'm trying to follow. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Geraldine, the postmistress. Geraldine, who was always delighted by visitors, had saved a box of undelivered and returned letters from earlier that week. This one came back from Dorset. She said, pulling out a green envelope. No longer at this address, it says. It was meant for Fiona Ross, sent from someone named Emil Grafton. Miss Marple's eyes lit with recognition. Grafton. She had seen that name before. Not in Marleycombe, but in a newspaper article 2 years ago. Former nanny accused in negligence dispute settles quietly. The Grafton family. Fiona had been employed by them in Dorset. The child, Arabella, had nearly drowned. And now someone from that family had found her again. Miss Marple examined the envelope. The stamp had been purchased in London, not Dorset. No return address. M. Clafton, she murmured. Mother, perhaps, or sister. Could be the girl herself, Geraldine offered. She'd be, 16 by now? Miss Marple's mind raced. A young girl, nearly drowned, abandoned in disgrace by her nanny, Fiona Ross. And now, a woman in navy standing at Fiona's grave, silent and still. What if the note hadn't been a threat? What if it was a promise? That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, notebook open, Napoleon asleep beside her. She wrote carefully. Second player confirmed. Initial poison from Mrs. Dunsley. Partial. Fatal dose from Emily Drew. Confessed. However, anonymous. Note likely sent by third party. Moll Grafton. Connection to Dorset case. Motivation, revenge. Action taken, unknown. Did she encourage Emily? Observe? Facilitate? More investigation required. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. 3 women, 3 needles. 1 murder. And just beyond the edge of truth, someone else's shadow still lingered. Chapter 11. The girl with no shadow from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing circle. Village. Marley Combite was the vicar who gave Miss Marple the final clue she hadn't known she was missing. They met that morning beneath the sycamore tree in the churchyard. He with his soft hat and thoughtful frown, she with her handbag. And a purpose. I meant to tell you something odd, he said. The young woman who visited Fiona's grave, she asked if the church kept records of visitors. Seemed anxious. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. That is strange. Most mourners don't worry about being seen. I asked for her name. She said it was Miss Lucy Gray. But when I checked the visitor's book afterward, he paused. The name she wrote was Annabel. Miss Marple still Annabel. Arabella Grafton, the child from the drowning case in Dorset, but Annabel. Perhaps a middle name. Perhaps an alias. But it was the way she used 2 names that mattered. Because people with nothing to hide never do. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened a small leather-bound ledger she kept beneath her stairs. A private archive of old newspaper clippings. Near the back, under the tab labeled Dorset, unsolved, she found it. Child's near drowning sparks dispute. Grafton family fires nanny. No charges pressed. Dated the 7th of August 1939. The article confirmed it. The child's full name was Annabel. Lucy Grafton. The same young woman, now grown, who had stood silently by Fiona Ross's grave. Miss Marple sat very still. She remembered something else. During the inquest, Fiona had denied being near the child when she fell. But witnesses claimed otherwise, that Fiona had left the child alone. Some said she saw Annabel in danger and walked away. A cruel act if true, and a girl like Annabel wouldn't forget something like that. But why come now? Why not act sooner? Unless... That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll past Marleycomb's new guest house, a modest converted cottage known as Lavender Lodge. She paused at the gate just as a woman stepped out. Slim, mid-20s, sharply dressed in a navy coat. Locked eyes. Good afternoon, Miss Marple said pleasantly. The woman gave a polite smile. Lovely village. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Though I don't believe we've met, Miss Grafton. A silence. Just a breath. But long enough. Sorry, the young woman said. You must be mistaken. I never am, Miss Marple said, not unkindly. I saw the lily you left. Annabel's face twitched. She ruined my life, she said, voice low. She was supposed to watch me. I was 5. I nearly died. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, you didn't kill her. Annabel looked up sharply. No, Miss Marple continued. But you encouraged someone else, didn't you? Annabel's voice trembled. She was already breaking. I could see it. Emily. She told me Fiona was back in her life. I reminded her. Just a little, just enough. You sent the note. I wanted her to be afraid, Jane. Just as I had been. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. And you never touched the tea? I watched it all happen. There was a silence between them. Not cold, but heavy. You were a child, Miss Marple said finally, and she wronged you. I don't want justice, Annabel said. I just wanted her gone. Miss Marple gave her a long, steady look. You'll leave tonight, she said softly, and you won't return, because Marleycombe has paid its price. Annabel nodded, tears unshed. Goodbye, Miss Marple. That evening, the guest-house light remained off Dot, and Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her knitting untouched, finally allowed herself a sigh. Fiona Ross had been killed by 3 women, one who feared her, one who hated her, and one who remembered Dot, and in the end, none had truly meant to murder. But some wounds run deeper than memory. Some threads never unravel cleanly, and Marleycombe, though quiet once more, would not soon forget the girl who returned with no shadow. Only consequence. Chapter 12. Threads left dangling from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing. Circle Village. Marleycombe's next day was market day, and yet Marleycombe's usual bustle felt subdued. The fruit stalls were arranged as always. The honey jars gleamed gold in the morning sun, and children played with sticks by the well, but the conversations were cautious, distant, thinned. Miss Marple noticed it all as she made her way through the square. She bought a jar of blackberry jam, nodded to Mr. Quill at the butcher's cart, and passed 2 women whispering by the flower stall. The name Fiona was no longer spoken aloud, only exchanged in glances and lowered voices, as if saying it might invite something back. She met Inspector Cray outside the bakery. She's gone, he said simply, handing her a warm paper bag. Left early this morning. Took the 6:40 train. Miss Grafton? She asked, though she already knew. He nodded, quiet as a shadow. Miss Marple accepted the scone he'd brought her. Apple and cinnamon, her favorite. Good. The further she is from here, the better. She's lived long enough with a ghost. Cray tilted his head. And what about us? We all have our ghosts, Inspector, Miss Marple replied. But the trick is not to let them follow us into the parlor. Meanwhile, at Ivy Cottage, Lavinia Temple stood at her window, watching the postman walk away. She held a letter in her hand. It was addressed in a firm, unfamiliar hand, postmarked from London. She opened it with shaking fingers. Mrs. Temple, I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want you to know you were right to fear her. I let myself believe Fiona would change. She didn't, but I did nothing. I let her break people. Emily, especially. She never deserved what happened. I will. Live with that? I hope you can live without her. C. Ross. Lavinia stared at the letter, her face unreadable. Then, without ceremony, she folded it in half and placed it into the fire. It curled and burned silently. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in her garden, trimming the hydrangeas. Judith Morley joined her with a pot of Earl Grey and 2 slices of sponge cake. Will the sewing circle continue? Judith asked. Miss Marple snipped the blossom. That depends. Are we still pretending it was about sewing? Judith sighed. We never sewed much. Mostly just talked and drank tea. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Then perhaps it's time we started over. Call it something else. The Fellowship of Women Who Know Too Much. Judith laughed. The first genuine laugh Miss Marple had heard in weeks. I'd join that, she said. But only if you promise never to knit me another pair of lavender mittens. I still haven't forgiven you. Deal, Miss Marple said, and they clinked teacups. That night she opened her notebook once more. Final entry. The sewing circle 3 needles. 3 intentions. 1 death. Mrs. Dunsley. Fear. Emily Drew. Despair. Annabel Grafton. Memory. Clive Ross. Complicity. Fiona Ross. Cruelty. No innocence, no monsters. Only wounds. Sometimes justice is not what you arrest. It's what you prevent from happening again. She closed the book and placed it in her locked drawer. Then she picked up her knitting, a fresh ball of navy wool, and began again. Chapter 13. The quiet return from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing circle. Village. Marleycombe Bune arrived with gentler winds, and Marleycombe softened under a wash of early summer sun. The hedgerows bloomed in full color. The school children practiced for the fete races, and the village, in its careful way, began to forget. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Fiona Ross had become a name tucked into cautious pauses. Emily Drew remained in county custody, awaiting formal hearing, but letters of support, petitions for leniency, and even quiet visits from villagers had begun to create a small, stubborn current of sympathy. Mrs. Dunsley, meanwhile, had resumed her weekly shopping, but she walked slower, spoke less, and never again brought her Victoria sponge to public events. As for Clive Ross, he had left. A housekeeper now managed Danby House, and it was said Mr. Ross had taken a temporary position overseas. The firm needed him in Switzerland, someone muttered at the post office. Banking things. Miss Marple, for her part, had resumed her usual rhythm. Tea at 4, knitting in the garden, church on Sunday, and once again, Wednesday afternoons. With the sewing circle, which now went by a gentler name, the Marleycombe Ladies' Social Guild. Same group. Less tension, Judith Morley said with a wink. Miss Marple agreed. Mostly, but there was one more thread still dangling, and it returned to her just after evensong one Sunday, in the form of a brown parcel left on her doorstep, wrapped in paper and tied with twine. It bore no sender's name, only the words, to Miss Marple. For your archive. She opened it inside. Careful and deliberate. Inside lay 3 items: a photograph, old, sepia-toned, slightly curled, of Fiona Ross as a young nanny, holding a small blonde child near a lake; a newspaper clipping, the original article from the Grafton scandal, circled in red ink; a typed note: I have kept this for too long. She didn't push me. She walked away when I called. That's what I remember. They said it was trauma. I was 5, but I know now. She didn't want me to die, but she didn't care if I did, and that was enough. A.G. Miss Marple read it twice. Then, carefully, she folded the note and placed it in her locked archive. She left the photograph on her desk. Fiona, smiling, a child in her lap, the water shimmering behind them. So much could have been different, Miss Marple thought. A single turn of compassion, a step taken toward, not away. But it hadn't been. And now all they had were echoes. That night, as dusk stretched across Marleycombe, the sewing circle met again in the village hall. No new members joined. No speeches were made. But there was laughter again, a little, and someone passed around scones that weren't too dry. Miss Marple drank her tea, listened, and watched the way people stitched. Not just cloth, but connection. At the far end of the room, Lavinia Temple was showing young Daisy Hart how to pin pleats. Her hands steady, her voice kind. Outside, the wind passed through the hedgerows. Inside, no one mentioned Fiona Ross. And for the first time in many weeks, truly, no one had to. Chapter 14. The pattern beneath the pattern from Miss Marple and the murder in the sewing circle. Village. Marleycombe Beath Marleycombe Ladies' Social Guild was, by all outward appearances, thriving. They had chosen a new project, hand-sewn gift sachets for the summer fete, filled with lavender, from Mrs. Tilling's garden. There was talk of starting a cookbook, reviving the tradition of Sunday puddings, and even a whisper that young Daisy Hart might take over leading the autumn wreath workshop. But Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, noticed something beneath. The laughter and lemon drizzle cake? A shift, not dramatic, nothing so vulgar as confrontation, but subtle, like the tension in a half-dropped stitch. The old alliances had frayed. New silences formed where easy chatter once lived. Some avoided each other's eyes. Others clung too closely to friendliness. It was the aftermath of truth. And truth, Miss Marple knew, had a way of unsettling the most delicate embroidery. That week she received another visitor. Unexpected, but not unwelcome. Detective Inspector Cray arrived without warning just after supper, hat in hand and a slight flush to his face. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, as Miss Marple ushered him in. "Not at all," she replied, motioning to the kettle. "You look like a man with an unsettled conscience, or a question." He smiled weakly. "Both, perhaps." They settled in, tea poured, rain beginning to patter faintly at the windows. Cray finally said, "The Grafton girl, we've confirmed. Her identity. She used a false name at Lavender Lodge, but her prints match a passport scan we obtained through Dorset police." Miss Marple nodded. "Annabel Lucy Grafton. She hasn't committed a crime, technically. But I've recommended we let the matter drop. The family has influence, and frankly, the press would love the story a little too much." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Justice doesn't always wear a uniform, Inspector. Sometimes it just stands at a graveside and says nothing." Cray looked at her. "You think it's finished?" Miss Marple paused. "No," she said quietly, "because people don't heal in straight lines. They loop back, revisit. Some wounds itch long after they've closed." He nodded. "Emily Drew's hearing is next week. There's talk of probation. A private facility, perhaps, with counseling." "She need more than that," Miss Marple murmured. "She need peace. And people who don't ask too many questions." Cray set down his cup. "You've seen a lot, Miss Marple." She smiled softly. "And yet people still believe I only knit scarves." Later that night, Miss Marple reopened her notebook, not the archive one, but a smaller pad she kept by her bed. She jotted a single phrase. The sewing circle was never about thread. It was about control. Who held it, and who was bound by it? She thought of Fiona's presence, dominating, precise, and how, even in death, her threads had entangled others. But now, bit by bit, they were being clipped. Mrs. Dunsley had baked a lemon tart again. Lavinia Temple had begun laughing without glancing around first. Judith Morley had stopped whispering. Small things. Human things. Recovery was quiet, Miss Marple knew, but it had begun. Outside, Marley combs settled beneath the hush of late June. And, inside a small cottage, one clever, elderly woman turned out her lamp, closed her notebook, and let the pattern rest. For now. Chapter 15. What the Cat Saw. From Miss Marple in The Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village, Marley Combe Pole. Miss Marple's gray tabby had always been a quiet observer, rather like his owner. He knew when postmen were late, when neighbors were arguing, even behind closed doors, and precisely where the warmest patch of afternoon sun would land. It was Napoleon, in fact, who first noticed the visitor. He was curled on the windowsill. Just after 10 that morning, when a woman in dark green arrived at the gate. She didn't ring the bell. She merely stood, one gloved hand resting lightly on the latch, looking up at the cottage with an unreadable expression. Miss Marple, seated nearby, noticed Napoleon's ears twitch before she saw the figure through the lace curtain. She rose slowly and opened the door. "Miss Marple?" the woman asked. Her voice was soft, with the careful modulation of someone used to being listened to. "Yes, dear. My name is Sarah Dunsley. I'm Mrs. Dunsley's daughter." They sat in the parlor. Sarah removed her gloves with precision and laid them flat across her lap. She looked nothing like her mother. She was lean, businesslike, and wore no jewelry save a plain watch. "I received your letter," she began. "I was in Bath when everything happened." Miss Marple nodded. "Your mother didn't wish to trouble you." "She never does," Sarah replied, with a trace of a smile. "But this time it might have helped if she had." Miss Marple waited. "I've read the reports, heard what she did, or thought she'd done. I suppose I came to ask a question." Miss Marple nodded again. "You may not like the answer." "I don't expect to," Sarah said. "I only want the truth. Did she poison Fiona Ross?" Miss Marple folded her hands. She attempted to, in a moment of fear and desperation. But the dose was too small. Someone else administered the fatal one. Your mother's conscience was heavier than her cup. Sarah looked down. "She's not a cruel woman, but she's frightened. Always has been. She hated Fiona, but she hated herself more for not standing up to her." Miss Marple's voice softened. "She wasn't the only one." Sarah looked up, meeting her eyes. "Do you think she'll recover from this?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then, recovery is rarely loud. It's stitched slowly, quietly. Your visit will help. More than you know. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple wrote a letter of her own. A short note to Emily Drew, care of the county facility, enclosed with a photograph of the Marleycombe garden taken that morning. Beneath it, she wrote, "The daisies are blooming again. I've planted one in your name." J.M. She sealed the envelope and walked it to the post box herself. She paused beneath the same sycamore tree where Fiona's funeral had taken place, where Annabel Grafton had once stood in silence. Only now, the tree cast no shadow. Back at her cottage, Napoleon had moved to the hearthrug. He blinked up at her slowly, as if to say, "You missed something." Miss Marple chuckled. "Did I?" And then she remembered something curious, something she hadn't considered. In weeks, Fiona Ross's will. Clive Ross had said nothing about it publicly. No solicitor had appeared at the sewing circle. No announcements had been made. And yet, Fiona had always been a planner, a manipulator. She'd have arranged something. Miss Marple stood very still. Was the case truly over? Or had Marleycombe not yet seen the last secret Fiona had sown? Chapter 16. The Will and the Way, from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marleycombe's solicitor's name was Mr. Neville Harcourt, and he was the sort of man who looked as though he'd been born wearing a waistcoat. He arrived in Marleycombe 2 days after Sarah Dunsley's visit, with a briefcase, an umbrella, and the precise frown of a man unused to delays. He asked for Miss Marple directly. "I'm here," he said, "to execute the late Miss Fiona Ross's final wishes. You are listed as a named party." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "How curious. She never liked me." Harcourt did not smile. "She liked surprise, Miss Marple." They sat at the vicar's study table, Harcourt carefully laying out 3 envelopes, one for Miss Marple, one for Clive Ross, and one marked "to be read aloud." Miss Marple opened hers with quiet fingers. Inside was a single sheet. You watched, but you never interfered. I wonder if deep down you were waiting for someone else to do what you never would. Enjoy the theater tickets. I always suspected you preferred fiction to truth. FRM Mrs. Marple glanced at the bottom of the envelope. Indeed, 2 tickets to Covent Garden. Expiring in August. Double quotes, "Very Fiona," she murmured. Harcourt cleared his throat. Miss Ross left a peculiar final letter. To be read aloud, she instructed. "Shall I?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, sitting back. I think we should all hear it. The final letter of Fiona Ross, read aloud in Marleycombe. To those remaining in Marleycombe, I was many things. Beautiful, clever, sharp. Also hated, envied, and feared. I didn't mind. People don't like mirrors. I merely reflected them. You all stitched your lies around me. But I saw them. Every thread Dot to Emily drew. If you're still breathing, I hope you feel brave. That poison was the first bold thing you ever did, Dot to Lavinia Temple. You were always 2 inches from screaming. I could have helped you. Instead, I enjoyed watching you tremble, Dot to the sewing circle, my greatest performance. I gave you all. Someone to hate, so you didn't have to look at yourselves, Dot to Clive. Ah, Clive, you were the one I didn't predict. Perhaps the only man who truly disappointed me. I leave you all this. A broken room, a cracked cup, and a story you'll retell. Without truth. And one more thing, there is another envelope. Not here, but with someone I trusted. Someone none of you noticed. You may not like what comes next. Fiona Ross. The room was silent. Harcourt coughed politely. There is, as she indicated, a second. Letter, one I was not given. She posted it to a third party weeks before her death. I have been advised not to disclose the name. Miss Marple folded her arms. Then we must wait. Harcourt packed up his briefcase and took his leave. Miss Marple remained seated, thoughtful. That night she wrote. Fiona's final move. Theatrical, cruel, unfinished. A second envelope. Hidden. Possibly blackmail, revenge, or confession. Likely. Sent to someone she believed could carry it out posthumously. But who? Not Clive. Not Emily. Not Annabel Grafton. She had her own agenda. Who else faded into the background? Who always listened, never spoke? She tapped the pen once against the page. Possibility. Mrs. Wren, church caretaker. Fiona paid. Her to clean after sewing circle meetings. Invisible, quiet, devoted. She would investigate in the morning. But even as she closed her notebook, Miss Marple felt it. The air in Marleycombe had changed again. The crime was over. But the game, it seemed, was not. Chapter 17. The Keeper of Keys from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marleycombe and Miss Marple never underestimated those who faded into the wallpaper. Quite the opposite. She often found the most vital clues resting in the lives of the unnoticed. Which is why, on a damp Tuesday morning, she made her way to the rear entrance of St. Michael's Church with a tin of currant biscuits and a gentle knock. Mrs. Wren? She called. The door creaked open, revealing a slight, wiry woman with tired eyes and hands perpetually stained by brass polish. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, blinking in surprise. "Didn't expect you today." Something wrong with the bell. "Ropes?" "No, dear," said Miss Marple. "I've just come to ask after an old envelope." They sat in the vestry kitchen, where the kettle groaned more than whistled. Miss Marple produced the biscuits, and Mrs. Wren, grateful, if suspicious, took 2. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that you were given a letter by Miss Fiona Ross." Mrs. Wren froze. Her hands, which had been steadying her teacup, began to tremble. "I didn't open it," she said quickly. "I was told not to. She paid me £5 to keep it until someone came asking for it. That's all." Miss Marple offered a small smile. "And now someone is asking." Mrs. Wren hesitated, then stood, walked to the cupboard behind the MOP sink, and reached into an empty biscuit tin. She returned with an envelope, sealed with red wax. On the front, in sharp black ink, were the words, "To be given to Miss Jane Marple, and no one else." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed the envelope on her table. She stared at it for a long moment before slicing the seal with a paper. Knifed out inside was a folded letter, and something heavier. She tipped it out onto her palm. A Small silver brooch dot, it was shaped like a thimble. Engraved with a date, the 17th of July, 1939. The letter read, Shane, you're clever. You see things. I envied that, once, this brooch belonged to the woman who first taught me to sew. She died the week before the war began. She was the only person who ever treated me kindly without agenda. I stole this from her before I ran. Away I kept it, for years. Because even monsters want something beautiful to hold dot, now I return it. To you. Because I know you'll understand what it means to give something back before the end. Do with it as you wish. Fiona Ross. Miss Marple sat in silence, holding the tiny brooch dot. It was not redemption. Not quite, but it was something Fiona had never given before. Acknowledgement. A gesture that didn't manipulate or punish, only gave. Perhaps in the final moments of her clever, cruel life. Fiona Ross had reached for something human. Miss Marple wrapped the brooch in linen and placed it in her drawer beside the letters, beside Emily's note, beside the sketch of the sewing circle's old seating chart. Then she lit a candle on the mantel, said nothing, and let it burn. The next morning, Mrs. Wren found another envelope tucked through her vestry door. Inside were two things. A new tin of biscuits, a single sentence in Miss Marple's neat hand. For those who keep the quiet. Corners of the world turning. Chapter 18. Lavender and Lies. From Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marleycombe Valley Bosebomb. Annual midsummer fete arrived beneath a sky so blue it looked painted. Bunting flapped between hedges, lemon ices dripped down children's wrists, and the scent of cut grass mingled with fresh scones and frying onions. It was the kind of day a village clings to, warm, bright, and steeped in the illusion of peace. And yet, Miss Marple knew peace was not quite the same as truth buried. The social guild stall was a triumph. Rows of lavender sachets tied with pale ribbon, jars of strawberry preserve, and Judith Morley's infamous invisible lemon cake. So named because it never lasted more than 20 minutes. But what intrigued Miss Marple most was not on the table. It was who had returned. Lavinia Temple, standing beneath the bunting with a plate of Victoria sponge, smiled in a way Miss Marple hadn't seen since before Fiona Ross's death. And beside her, to everyone's mild surprise, stood Clive Ross. He had arrived that morning, unannounced. Older, perhaps thinner, but calm. He nodded politely to villagers, spoke briefly to the vicar, and shook hands with Inspector Cray. His eyes scanned the fete, pausing just a beat too long on the social guild stall, and flicking to Miss Marple, who offered him a single, knowing nod. Later, as the brass band tuned up, Clive found her near the cricket boundary. I owe you an apology, he said. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Only one? He smiled faintly. You tried to warn me about her, Fiona. No, Miss Marple said. I never warned you. I only asked questions you didn't wish to answer. Clive looked away. I thought I needed someone like her, clever, driven, someone who made things happen. And instead, Miss Marple said softly, she broke what you already had. He nodded. There was no real will, by the way. Only that public letter and the theater tickets. Her money vanished. Tied up in debts, fake charities, shell companies. I've had to start over. She left nothing? Clive pulled a small envelope from his pocket. She left this to me privately. A week before her death. He handed it to Miss Marple. Inside was a single slip of paper. Marleycombe was never yours. I only came back to take it away. Miss Marple folded the note slowly. She was wrong, you know, she said. Clive looked surprised. About Marleycombe? No, Miss Marple replied. About who owned the village. It was never hers or yours or anyone else's. It belongs to the people who love it without needing to possess it. Clive looked around, at the laughing children, the flower stalls, the simple joy of the brass band warming up. And then, for the first time in what felt like years, he said, "I think I understand." That evening, as dusk settled and the fate began to quiet, Miss Marple helped Judith pack up the remaining sachets. Only 4 had gone unsold. "Not bad for a village still healing," Judith said with a smile. "Lavender is resilient," Miss Marple replied, tying a ribbon. Judith paused. "Did we do the right thing, Jane? Not telling everything? About Annabel, about Mrs. Dunsley, about the rest." Miss Marple was quiet a moment. "We told enough," she said. "The rest is between them and their consciences. Sometimes mercy is the better thread." They looked out over the green, where lanterns glowed soft amber and music played faintly in the distance. It was not the same Marley Combe, but it was, at last, beginning to stitch itself whole again. Chapter 19. What Remains Unspoken from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marley Combe beneath days after the fate passed in a golden hush. Marley Combe, in its usual way, tucked the summer into its sleeves. Jars of jam placed in cool cupboards, bunting folded into baskets, lawn chairs brushed and put away. The village didn't forget what had happened that spring, but it was beginning to live beside it. And yet, Miss Marple sensed something still unfinished. Not quite wrong, but not quite right. One morning, she opened the small side drawer of her writing desk, the one she rarely touched. Inside was the envelope left by Fiona's solicitor, the silver thimble brooch, and her archive notes from the investigation. She reread the final entries. Fiona's hold over the village unraveled by fear, guilt, and memory. But one person never spoke, never testified, never wept. Lavinia Temple. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Ivy Cottage. Lavinia was in her garden, planting marigolds with a neatness that bordered on obsession. "You've given it order, Miss," Marple said, nodding to the flower beds. Lavinia looked up, dirt on her gloves. "It needed it." "So did you," Miss Marple said gently. "And you've found some, haven't you?" Lavinia wiped her hands and gestured to the bench. "I did. What they all wanted to do," she said after a long silence. "I hated Fiona, but I feared her more. I let her return, hoping it would be different. It wasn't. I watched her destroy Emily again. I watched her play Clive like a violin. And I did nothing." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you want to kill her?" Lavinia blinked. "No, I wanted her to leave. That's all. But she never would." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out the thimble brooch. "I believe this belonged to a woman Fiona once loved. A kindness she could never repay. But she gave it back, not to Lavinia Temple, or Emily Drew, or even to Annabel, but to me." "Why?" Lavinia's eyes filled with something ancient and tired. "Because you were the only one who didn't hate her. You pitied her." Miss Marple was quiet. "She thought that made you weak," Lavinia said softly. "But she was wrong." They sat in silence, 2 women surrounded by marigolds, teacups, and wounds mostly healed. That evening, Miss Marple wrote one last note in her archive. The final silence was Lavinia's, not guilt, but grief. Grief for who Fiona might have been. Grief for the self she lost while surviving her. Fiona died by poison, yes, but long before that, she was unmade by her own sharpness. And the rest of us simply stood around her, hoping we wouldn't be cut too deeply. Asterisk as the sunset Napoleon leapt into Miss Marple's lap and curled like a comma. The village was still. No footsteps on the lane. No letters through the door. Just the creak of trees and the weight of what no longer needed to be said. Chapter 20. A Stitch in Silence from Miss Marple and the Murder in the Sewing Circle. Village. Marley Combe was a quiet morning inn. Marley Combe when the final act of the sewing circle unfolded, not with a confession or an arrest, but with a gesture so simple it might have gone unnoticed by anyone but Miss Marple. She was at the Social Guild's weekly gathering, seated beside Judith Morley, who was attempting, rather disastrously, to embroider a daffodil. Across the room, Mrs. Dunsley arrived. She wore pale lilac and carried a tin of oat biscuits. Her face was pinched but composed. Her steps steady. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the ribbon on her blouse, pale silver gray, looped neatly through a small gleaming pin. Thimble. Fiona Ross's brooch. Mrs. Dunsley said nothing about it. Nor did anyone ask. But Miss Marple noticed Lavinia Temple glance up, just once. No malice. No surprise. Just the faintest nod. A silent understanding passed between women who had once trembled under someone else's shadow, and now no longer did. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor as twilight pressed against the windows. The long summer was beginning its slow slide into autumn. The roses would fade soon, and the wind would change, and people would start asking again about chimney sweeps and Sunday puddings. But tonight was still, and she had things to write. She opened her notebook and turned to a fresh page. Final summary. The sewing circle case. Fiona Ross died from poisoned tea, but the murder was shared. Mrs. Dunsley, who feared her. Emily Drew, who broke under her. Annabel Grafton, who remembered her. Lavinia Temple, who survived her. All carried a fragment of the crime. None bore it alone. And yet, it was not justice that restored Marley Combe. It was mercy. A quiet stitching together of what remained. The village changed, not violently, not loudly, but slowly, thread by thread. Some patterns can't be unpicked, but they can be covered, softened, mended. She closed the notebook. Napoleon gave a long, sleepy stretch on the WINDOZLE. The fire crackled. Outside, the sky deepened into ink, and the stars rose slowly over Marley Combe. And in the cottage on Church Lane, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a tender heart set down her knitting, folded her hands, and let the silence hold.